Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Menachem Begin Heritage Center weekly English Zoom program. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Begin Center, and every week I speak to a guest about a topic that is relevant to Israeli policy or wider Middle East issues or the Jewish world or some combination of that. Those of you who are new to this will just so you're familiar with the format. I'm going to talk to our guest for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then you guys can put your questions into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and I will choose some of those to put to our guest. So what we're doing today is we're going to be looking at a regional issue, but a little different from some of the things that we've discussed in the past, which focus on maybe a specific country like Iran or a specific topic. That is, a wider security topic. We're going to talk about energy. We're going to talk about the resources, the availability of those resources or scarcity of those resources, how they're impacting regional politics, and also how Israel fits into this wider picture. Many of you will be aware, for example, that in recent years, Israel sort of somewhat out of the blue discovered that it had access to natural gas off the coast, which has changed things in certain ways for Israel in this kind of fossil fuel question. And of course, there's the issue of the environment and renewables, which Israel is also playing a part. And we're going to hear all about that from our guest. I really do have, I think. Excuse me, the very best person I could have to speak to about these topics, Dr. Elai Rettig, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University, specializing in energy geopolitics. He was previously the Israel Institute Fellow in Israeli and Environmental Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, and a lecturer in the Jones Graduate School of Business at Rice University in Houston. He was also a researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv and a senior researcher at the Maritime Policy and Strategy Research Center in the University of Haifa. He is one of Israel's leading experts on this topic. He's testified before the Knesset on matters regarding energy and national security. And it's really a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Elai Rettig to the Begin Center, virtually at least. Elai, great to see you.
Great to see you too, Paul. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh. Okay, so let's start with a sort of broad question. I think now I might be wrong, but I don't think that anyone in the audience here is an expert in the politics of energy, especially in the Middle East. I might be wrong, and someone will correct me if I am. But I'm pretty sure that everyone here is familiar with the role that energy plays. And has played historically in the Western, especially American, engagement in the Middle East oil, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, all those issues. And I think also people are aware that the situation is changing with the move away from fossil fuels, and also other changes in how countries are getting their energy. So maybe you can start by sort of educating us a little about how things stand in 2022. What are the main headline topics for this issue of energy and how it's impacting regional politics?
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction and the questions. The Middle East is an oil-dependent region. The economies, especially of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, etc., are very much dependent on oil. Most of the revenue, when I say most, 80%, in Qatar 90%, is dependent on the export and the continued export of crude oil to the market. Most of it goes to East Asia, not that much to the West, as we tend to think. The US is not dependent on Middle East oil, but US allies are definitely dependent on Middle East oil, whether it's Europe and definitely in Asia. And the regime stability, the ability to subsidize the people, the contract between the government and the people, where you don't protest, you don't have a say in what's going on, but in return, we subsidize everything, almost free electricity, free gasoline, etc. that is dependent on the continuation of oil production and oil exports. And that's not going to change anytime soon. So the biggest issue that we tend to talk about in the media among analysts is what happens on the day that we stop using fossil fuels, especially oil. What happens on the day that we transition to renewables? Will all of the regimes around us start collapsing when they don't have their main source of revenue to sell anymore? And that concern is a bit exaggerated. The Gulf states are going to be fine for a while with their oil. And their economy is very much going to remain oil dependent, and even more so in the midterm. When I say more so in the midterm, 20, 30, 40 years into the future, they're even going to control more of the global market share for oil because they have the cheapest oil in the world. And this might be surprising when I say this, because we often talk about the transition, and everybody, when you look at the media, you see Facebook is moving to 100% renewables and Google is moving to 100% renewables. There's a big gap between what we see in the media and public discourse and the harsh reality that is the world is dependent on fossil fuels and especially on oil, and that addiction is not going to end anytime soon. And the reason there's this gap between what we think and what they say in the media is that first, we tend to think that our discussion tends to be very Western focused. And we keep talking about how in the West we're moving to renewables. Most of the consumption of fossil fuels in the world is not in the West anymore. China is the biggest importer of oil in the world. It burns more coal than the rest of the world combined. China and India together are about more than 35% of fossil fuel consumption. So we need to talk about the rest of the world. And when we look at the pie, right, we say, okay, we're moving towards renewables. 82% of the energy that we consume around the world is fossil fuels. It's oil, it's gas, it's coal. The rest is mostly biomass, burning wood and animal dung in third world countries, and 5% nuclear. Everything that we read in the news, solar, wind, geothermal, wave energy, all of that is about 3% of the global energy consumption. So 82% is still fossil fuels, the same as it was in the 70s. Nothing has really changed. And the reason we conflate and kind of surprised by this number is that we keep talking about energy when we actually mean electricity. When you read the news, you see, okay, Europe is moving towards renewables and nuclear. That's just for electricity. But electricity is 25% of why we use energy. It's a minority. Most of why we use fossil fuels is not for electricity. It's for agriculture and transportation and industry. It's not for electricity. And especially oil is not used for electricity at all. Right. And renewables, nuclear, they only know how to generate electricity. So even if we move 100% to renewables, even if we move 100% to clean energy, non-fossil fuel, that doesn't affect oil at all because oil isn't used for electricity consumption. The only countries that still use oil for electricity are small island states and the Gulf states in the Middle East because the oil is so cheap for them, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. So the transition towards renewables is not going to affect oil consumption in the near future. Why do we use oil and why do we need it so much? And why is the Middle East, why are we so consumed with Middle East politics because of oil? Because oil is in absolutely everything. Look in the room around you, from the ceiling to the floor, everything has oil in it. We tend to think, okay, oil is about cars. So if we just move to Teslas and electric vehicles, we won't need oil anymore and the Middle East will collapse. Even if today we decide no more gasoline-powered cars, no more, we don't sell anymore, and by 2040, we only have electric vehicles around the world, that reduces the consumption of oil by about 5% of what it is today. That's it. That's not the main driver of oil. The main driver of oil is everything we have. Oil is in everything. Whether oil is an ingredient in the product, whether it's plastic, whether it's rubber, whether it's glasses on your face, whether it's the computer that I'm speaking through, whether it's the nylon in my shirt, whether it's the makeup, the mascara on your eyes, it has oil in it. Whether it's the concrete in the wall in front of you, the soot, the binding material in concrete has oil in it. Whether it's toothpaste or shower curtains or anything, really the soles of your shoes, it has oil in it. And even if oil is not an ingredient in the product itself, there isn't a single product in the world, there isn't a single food that you've eaten unless it's a carrot that you grew in your backyard, and even then, if you use non-organic fertilizer, then that's oil, was brought to you by a ship or a plane or a truck or a train. And usually all of these things combined from where they were manufactured or grown to where you got to you. So everything around the world has oil as an ingredient in it or in the transportation of it. And that means a bunch of things. One, we're not going to stop our addiction on Middle East oil anytime soon, because Middle East oil is the cheapest oil around. Even at $10 a barrel, Saudi Arabia still makes a profit. It's one of the only countries that can say that it can still make a profit from $10 a barrel. It's great grade of oil, so you can also refine it very cheaply. And I'm not saying it to discourage. I'm very much pro-environmental. I don't have a car. But if we want to understand the challenge, we need to assess the challenge properly. And we're not going to stop the addiction anytime soon. The second reason why I'm saying this is if oil is expensive, everything becomes expensive because everything has oil in it, whether in the product itself or whether in the transportation of it or whether in the production of it or the packaging, everything has oil. So if oil becomes $100 a barrel for a while, everything becomes more expensive. You're probably seeing this around you. Energy prices are high, so everything is expensive because everything has fossil fuels in it. And the third thing, and this is kind of to answer your question, is because oil is in everything, and because when oil prices are high, everything becomes high and everything becomes expensive and we get into a recession, then if something happens in an oil producing and exporting country, and because of that, whether it's a civil war, whether it's political instability, and because of that instability, there's less oil coming out of the ground and being exported to the global market, then it's everyone's business. It doesn't matter if you're directly buying oil from that country. It doesn't matter if you're not even buying oil from Saudi Arabia. If something happens in Saudi Arabia and because of that, they're not exporting oil, the price of oil goes up for everyone and all of the manufacturer, right? So it goes to China. China with that oil creates plastics and rubber, et cetera. Everything becomes expensive to you too, even if you're not using Saudi Arabian oil. And because of that, we will go, our leaders, and it doesn't matter if it's Trump or Obama. It doesn't matter if it's the Chinese leader or the Indian leader. It doesn't matter if it's democracy or not. If it's an industrial country that's dependent on oil imports, it will go to great lengths to appease and have good relations with those that control oil, with the countries that have it and have very cheap oil and can promise you a reliable supply of oil. And you will look the other way, whether it's human rights abuse, and you will do a lot to ensure their power and stability if they promise you oil, especially during times of crisis, especially when there's not enough oil for everyone, especially when someone's trying to block, there's a war and someone's trying to block your oil transit. You will do a lot to keep that country happy and if you don't, then you're going to pay for it eventually. As we see with the Biden administration, that kind of went a little too far with criticizing Mohammed bin Salman, and now is trying to backpedal with that, kind of learning the lesson of that. Yeah, sorry.
I wanted to just sort of cut in there. So the Biden sort of rapprochement with the Saudis is a lot to do with, at least my understanding, is a lot to do with, of course, what's happening in Europe, in the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the fact that as a result of that, suddenly there is a need to be back on terms with the Saudis. So can you tell us a little about like how has the war in Ukraine affected this situation and why?
So the war in Ukraine is interesting in how it affected the energy market because suddenly policymakers are seeing the actual realities of what can you get away with and kind of the gap between what they said they were going to do at the beginning of the war and what they actually realized that they can do. Europe at the beginning said, we're not going to buy oil and gas from the Russians anymore. Right. Very quickly realized that's not very realistic. With gas, you have the problem of gas it's gas, it's not liquid. You can't just get the gas from somewhere else just because you decided right now. You need to build a pipeline to somewhere else to get actual gas, or you need liquefied natural gas, and that's very expensive, and you need to build terminals for that. It takes time. You can switch the power plants. You can switch it to coal. You can continue the nuclear. You can create electricity somehow else. With oil, there's no replacement for oil. There's nothing else that does what oil does. Oil is not for electricity. So you can't just stop using it. And if you're not going to buy Russian oil, you need to get that oil from somewhere else. Otherwise, you have a big problem. it's not just your cars or your concrete. Your military doesn't move without oil. It doesn't matter how many battleships and tanks, et cetera, you have. If you don't have oil supply, you don't have a military. So the US, Europe has approached the Middle East and asked them, right, OPEC, Saudi Arabia, UAE, to up their production and get more oil to Europe to replace Russian oil. Russia, in return, is selling more oil to China and India in a deep discount. And that's taking away market share from the Gulf. Usually 90% of the oil that comes from the Gulf goes to East Asia, to China, India, Japan, South Korea. Russia is selling at a deep discount, 30%, 35% discount. And that's taking away market share from the Gulf. And Europe is asking for that oil in return. Now that means more oil going through the Suez Canal and up to Europe, more Emirati oil, more Saudi oil. That's a big target for Iranian sabotage, because that's a great opportunity for Iran to pressure the West and pressure the US and say, listen, you need oil, I have oil, get the sanctions away from me. Cut a nuclear deal with me, even if it's not ideal, and let me produce more oil to save the day. And so the US, Europe are in a dilemma. They need more oil. They don't want Russian oil. They need to get more Saudi oil, so they need to appease the Saudis. They want Iranian oil, so they want to cut a deal with Iran. They even want Venezuelan oil at this point. So they're willing to talk to Maduro. And, with Iran, Iran exports oil. You don't need to help it. So you can just look the other way and ignore the sanctions for a while and let Iran export oil without saying anything. With Venezuela, it doesn't work like that. You need to actually send an American company to produce that oil, because it's very special oil. Only American companies know how to do that. So the US West is in a big dilemma, and they realize that they need the Middle East. The US can disengage from the Middle East. It could say that it's leaving the Middle East, but the Middle East won't leave the USA. And it's realizing that when the crisis is now happening.
Right, that's fascinating. Can you let's pivot to that. We're getting a lot of questions coming in, which is great, and I will get to those in time. But let's pivot to Israel. So a lot of people on this in this meeting, on this call, will be aware about the gas fields that Israel discovered. Was it I don't know, 7-8 years ago, more than that, a decade ago?
2009, 2010, so more than a decade.
More than a decade ago. And Israel, it seems to me, again, it's not a topic I'm such an expert in, but it seems to me that there was a lot of debate about how much Israel should use this, what should it do with it, who should it sell it to. I know there was talk of a project the Eastern Mediterranean project, which would transport gas from Israel to Cyprus and Greece. And I think the US a few months ago withdrew its support for that. Turkey now, as part of its renewing ties with Israel, renewing its friendship with Israel, wants to get Israeli gas. What are the factors that Israel is considering? What are the considerations that Israeli governments, regardless of who the government is? I mean, it's not necessarily a political thing, but what an Israeli government having to decide what to do with this gas. What are the considerations that are impacting those decisions?
Right. So that's a great question, and I will not share my personal opinion. I will give kind of the most objective analysis that I can regarding what are the considerations of the Israeli government regarding the gas.
Okay.
I will start by saying it's gesinnte Tzuris. It's good trouble to have. It's
right.
Whatever Israel decides to do, we're in a good place. Electricity prices are sky high in Europe. In Israel, same, because we have domestic gas on a long-term contract on a fixed price. We're good. Our inflation is less than Europe by a mile, and I think the Israeli public doesn't really appreciate that. But we're in a very good condition. The question is, should we and how much should we export the gas outside? So just to give kind of an overview, Israel found it found 2 big fields and 2 small fields. The 2 big ones are Tamar and Leviathan, the 2 small ones, Karish and Tanin. Together, it's about 950 billion cubic meters of gas. So imagine, I'm sorry, I'm doing meters and not feet, but imagine a 3D transparent cube, right? 1 meter each side, fill it up with gas, and now imagine 950 billion of these cubes. It sounds a lot. It's not that much. It's a lot for our purposes.
Right.
It's not a lot when it comes to global generation of gas. So we have about 950 BCM. Russia has 44,000 BCM, right? Turkmenistan has 17,000 BCM. We have 900. So we're not a global competitor. But for Israel, it's a lot because we consume 12 BCM of gas every year. By the future, it'll become 15 BCM. That's still enough gas for the next 60 to 70 years. And so the kind of considerations Israel has is, should we keep it for the next generation? You know, it's kind of the holy grail, energy independence for Israel. The joke, Golda Meir's joke was that Moses took us for 40 years around the desert to stuck us, you know, in the only place in the Middle East that doesn't have any oil. And a lot of our foreign policy was to get the oil. So now we actually have it. So why should we sell it? That's the one consideration. But to properly answer kind of, should we export, should we not export? We need to know a lot of things that we don't actually know. We need to know, maybe first thing is how much gas is still in the water that we haven't found yet. We need to know how quickly is the world going to stop using gas because we're going to move to renewables. If we're going to move to renewables in the next 50 years, then we need to sell the gas as quickly as possible because otherwise we're going to get stuck with gas that nobody wants. Yeah. We need to understand what the price is going to be. 2 years ago, Europe was paying $2 per British thermal unit per BTU, and we can't make a profit from less than $8 per BTU if we sell it to Europe. Nobody will buy it at $8, but today it's $25 because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So suddenly the calculations change. So we don't know all of that, but Israel is going without having the complete answers. This is the gamble that Israel is taking. Israel is taking a gamble that there is more gas to be found in the East Mediterranean Sea. According to US geological surveys, we only found a third of the potential natural gas that's in those waters. I include Cyprus and Lebanon in that. And so there's still a lot of gas yet to take out. But the thing is, if you don't find a market to sell that gas to, there's no reason to take it out of the ground. Oil, this is where gas is very different from oil. Oil is liquid. You take it out of the ground and you find someone to sell it to. You take it out of the ground, you put it in tankers and you ship it around the world to whoever wants to buy it. If China doesn't want to buy it now, they'll still buy it anyway because it's cheap and they'll put it in silos. Or maybe you'll just leave the tanker in the middle of the sea and wait. You don't need to know who you're selling it to before you develop the field. With gas, because it's gas, you need to physically connect the gas field, even if it's in the bottom of the sea, right, all the way with a pipeline, a physical pipeline to whoever's going to consume that gas. And until you don't have, and for that you need a customer. So until you don't have a client on the other side that says, I want to buy that gas from you, and you don't build a multi-billion-dollar pipeline all the way to that consumer, you can't get the gas out of the ground. Wow. Now, when I'm talking about an underwater pipeline, this is an $8 billion endeavor. So you need someone to commit on a binding contract for the next 15 years on a fixed price that they are willing to pay a very high price for the gas, so I can recuperate the costs of the pipeline. So far, Israel has not found a customer in Europe. We have a lot of secretaries, Ministry of Energy, of Italy, of Greece, they're all shaking hands, but there's no private company actually willing to put the money and say, I am willing to buy this gas for 15 years ahead on $8 per BTU. Now, 2 years ago, definitely not, because gas was $2 per BTU. Today it's 25, but what customers in Europe are saying is, okay, today it's 25, but that's because there's a Russia-Ukraine war. If we build this pipeline all the way from Israel to Europe, it will take 5 years to build. By 2027, will there still be a war between Russia and Ukraine? Is there still going to be a Putin? Is gas prices still going to be $25? I don't want to commit to $8 per BTU for 15 years because the price might crash again. So it's very hard for Israel to find someone willing to buy the gas. And so far, with all of what Israel decided as 45% of the gas that we have, we want to sell. The idea is that we enjoy the revenue now, and we get other companies to come look for the other 2/3 of the gas that's possibly in the waters. thing is, we can't find someone to buy the gas. We managed to sell gas to Jordan and Egypt, but that's just 150 BCM out of the 450 BCM that we have to sell. That's a third. If we can't prove to an international company, energy company, that there's someone to sell the gas that we already found and earmarked for export, there's no chance that it'll come look for more gas. Because even if they find it, we can't prove that they have someone to sell it to. There's no reason to get out of the ground. So that's Israel's gamble. Israel's looking for someone. You don't need to convince Israel to sell gas. Israel wants to sell gas. It already decided that it's going to sell 450 BCM, but they can't find anyone to sell it to. Now, there was the Eastnet pipeline. That was the idea to sell it to Europe. It's a very ambitious plan. It's not economically feasible at all. If we build this pipeline, I can show you a map, but if we build this pipeline from Israel to Greece, it'll be the longest, deepest underwater pipeline in the world. In East Mediterranean, it goes really deep. It goes 2 kilometers underground, the sea in the Mediterranean Sea. It's a deep bathtub. We've never in our lives built a pipeline that deep in the ocean. Nord Stream 2 goes 200 meters underwater. This pipeline is going to go 2,000 meters underwater. We don't know how to build that deep. It's space technology to build this kind of pipeline.
Sorry, why does it need to be so much deeper?
It needs to go on the bottom of the.
I see.
The North Sea is much shallower.
The North Sea is shallower, right?
Yeah, and that also means that the pressure of the water
is much greater. Yeah.
Yeah, it limits how much the width of the pipeline.
Wow.
So it also limits how much gas you can get through it. In Crete, in the island of Crete, the bottom of the ocean is volcanic, so it moves. It costs a lot to build that pipeline. So you need a high price. You need someone in Greece or in Italy to agree to buy it for 15 years for a high price. And so far, we haven't succeeded. And yes, the Russia-Ukraine war is making things expensive, and Europe is looking for gas anywhere, but not for a solution in 5 years from now. Because 5 years from now, no one knows to tell you that the gas prices are still going to remain high and justify this pipeline. And so the US basically said, stop talking about the Eastnet pipeline. Start talking about other solutions, because this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make economic sense. So Turkey is another option, selling the gas to Turkey. Turkey is a huge market for gas. They consume a lot of gas. And technically, you can get the gas to Europe, technically. Although Europe doesn't really like that idea that Turkey is going to become the main transit country for gas to Europe. It's not you solved one problem, you created another.
Right.
You're dependent on Turkey now. So there's a bunch of problems with Turkey politically. We can't commit to a private company that 10, 15 years from now, that's the contract that you need. Relationship will remain stable. The Turks are not going to use it as a political tool against us. Out of the two, if we sell gas to Turkey, Turkey is the one that has the political power over us. It's not always the gas exporter that has the power. Turkey doesn't need Israeli gas. It has gas from a lot of places. So if out of the two, if we start selling to Turkey as our main customer, we can't really, threaten to stop the gas. It's like shooting ourselves in the foot. Turkey can say that they don't want Israeli gas because of an operation in Gaza, and they can reliably do so because they have gas from Azerbaijan and Iran and Iraq and Russia, of course. So out of the two, Israel is not keen on getting into this marriage. Oil is like dating. You sell oil to a country, suddenly it doesn't want it. You sell it to another country, But gas trade is a Catholic wedding. It's married with children. You need to know who you're getting in bed with. Technically, you can get a divorce, but it costs a lot of money, okay? So it's like a marriage. So you need to know who you're building the pipeline to. And because those two options, pipeline to Europe, pipeline to Turkey, isn't really... in Israel, we're starting to talk about liquefied natural gas, which is basically freezing the gas to a point where it becomes a liquid, putting it in an LNG tanker, which is a huge, expensive floating refrigerator that brings it all the way to Europe. In Europe, there's a regasification terminal. It turns it back into gas, and then it flows it through the pipelines, and it's as if it's gas. The problem with that is that it doubles the price of the gas to liquefy it, this entire kind of endeavor. But that's currently the most kind of quickest way to help Europe with its current crisis with Russia. We don't have LNG facilities in Israel. Egypt has. Egypt has 2 of them, and they're working under capacity. So the option is to sell from Israel to Egypt, and Egypt liquefies it and sells it to Europe. There's a lot of talk around that, but keep in mind that we're talking about really small amounts of gas. We don't have the infrastructure to do that because the gas that goes to Egypt is going through the same pipelines that is also bringing gas to Israel. So during the summer, there's a limit to how much gas you can actually get through that pipeline because Israel also needs that gas. So we're talking about maybe 2 BCM a year. Europe needs to replace 150 BCM from Russia. That doesn't really help it. The only way to actually make it count is if we build another pipeline that goes directly from the gas fields directly to the LNG terminals in Egypt. And that takes about 2 to 3 years to build. Other options is a floating LNG facility where you can take a ship and that ship is like an LNG terminal. It knows how to liquefy the natural gas on the ship, but that's much lower amounts of gas. It's limited in how much gas it can create. If in a pipeline, I can get 16 BCM per year in a pipeline. In a floating LNG, I can create maybe in a really big one, 6 BCM a year, something like that. And there's only 3 ships in the world that can do 6 BCM. One of them caught on fire a few months ago. So you need to build one. And that takes a few years. So we don't really have a current solution for Europe's crisis, which they kind of walked into with their eyes wide open. And it's not really our role to save them from themselves, but it creates much kind of this spirit of a business environment that someday Israel might be able to finally export more of its gas and bring more energy companies to look for more gas in Israel. So that's more or less the consideration regarding our options.
Okay, that's really important information. I think probably new information for most of us, certainly for me. So I guess some of the I think here in Israel there has been a lobby. I don't know how big a lobby against the gas sort of environmental argument against and the idea that Israel should be focusing more on sustainable sources of energy. And I know that where you work at Bar-Ilan University, there's an institute, the National Institute for Sustainable Energy, which is putting a lot of time and resources into developing technological innovations for sustainable energy. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit about the work that's going on there, and maybe just the broader question of how much of an impact can Israel make on this whole question of sustainable energy? Because you said at the beginning that it's not going to make much of a dent in the oil market because we're talking about different issues. We're talking about electricity rather than what oil does. But clearly there is a huge hunger, at least in the West, for sustainable energy options. And what role can Israel, small though it is, play in that sort of whole endeavor?
So Israel has huge potential in that sense, not necessarily on our markets. Solar energy isn't getting where we want it to get, but we have a potentially huge influence on the market because we were never good at selling, crude resources. That was never our thing in Israel. Our thing was always to sell ideas, patents, technology. That's what we know how to do. And Israel is a leader in solar technological innovation because we face problems that no other country faces, or at least no other Western country that's actually looking for solutions. And that has always been kind of our strength. It's not that we're smarter than anyone else, although some would say we are, but it's that we need to deal with problems before everyone else does, right? We launch our satellites to the west instead of the east because we're afraid that our satellites will fall into enemy territory. So we need to build lighter, smaller satellites. And because of that, we're the leader in miniature satellite technology. And now all of the private companies, SpaceX, they're all using our satellite technology because we had a security necessity and now we're selling it. Same thing with agriculture. We were afraid that we will be embargoed and we won't have any food. So we had to learn how to grow our food in warmer climate with less water. And today, growing food in warmer climate with less water is a problem that everybody has because of climate change. We had that since the 50s. So we already found solutions and now we can sell them. So same thing with water desalination, Iron Dome, etc. Same thing with solar energy. Today, the world is talking about solar PV because of climate change. We've been trying to do solar PV since the 50s, and climate change was not a thing back then. It's not something we talked about. We had a problem that we didn't have any resources. And until the 80s, all of our electricity was from oil, and oil was hard to find in Israel because all of the major oil countries were boycotting us. So since the 50s, we were trying to look for solar solutions. We had a lot of sun. Water heaters, dud shemesh, the solar water heaters, is an Israeli invention from the 50s. In the 70s, there was a law that you have to put a solar water heater on your roof because the oil prices became so high that we were trying to take pressure off of the grid. So every house in Israel, 90%, has solar panels on the roof. In the early 2000s, Israel started going straight into solar PV panels, creating electricity out of it. Not because of climate, but because of security. We realized oil prices and coal prices and gas prices were going high in the early 2000s. So we wanted to create our own cheaper alternative for electricity, which is independent. That was our main thing. Independent, not dependent on other countries to get our electricity. So since the early 2000s, we've been trying to put solar PV everywhere, on our Knesset, on the parliament, right? On anything that's security related. Let's say there's an earthquake in Jerusalem, there needs to be a gathering place. So the Teddy soccer stadium is the gathering place in an emergency in Jerusalem. So the Teddy soccer stadium is completely, has solar PVs everywhere. So even if there's a blackout in the entire country, the Teddy soccer stadium will have electricity. We look at solar PV as a security necessity, not as a climate thing. And 2006, Second Lebanon War made that even clearer. One of the major advantages of a coal plant or a gas plant over a solar plant is the size. You can create much more electricity in a smaller size with coal. There's no other way around it. You need huge swaths of land to create electricity from solar. With coal, with a small, relatively small power plant, you can create a lot of electricity, and that's the main advantage. Well, that's not an advantage in Israel because we get rocket attacks on us. So in 2006, when Hezbollah was trying to hit our power plants, suddenly we realized it's actually not that good that all of electricity generation is concentrated in one place. We need to decentralize it and create as many kind of mini power plants as possible around the country. So even if it gets hit by a rocket, so we look at solar panel as something that is a security necessity before everything else. And that changes the picture. That's why we started investing it before everyone else. Now, Israel has some really big challenges. We want to get to 30% renewables by 2030. That's our goal. 2030 is 30% of electricity. The rest is from natural gas. That's probably not going to happen. We're probably not going to reach 30%. Right now, we're just 7%. We're not where we want to be, mostly because we suddenly found gas and all the calculations changed. We have a domestic. We don't need energy independence from solar. We have energy independence from gas. And once you build a gas power plant, you're stuck with it for 40 years. So, and the gas plant creates more electricity than a solar plant. And it's much more stable, more reliable, and it creates electricity 24 hours a day. And solar panels don't. And solar panels take a huge swath of land, but we're still trying to get to 30%. And if there's one thing that's a problem in Israel, is land. We don't have a lot of it. And we're kind of at war over land. So we don't have a lot of land to give to solar panels. And technically, if you look at the map, there's a lot of land in the Negev desert, but it's not really free because a third of that land in the Negev desert is IDF, is Israeli military training grounds. They don't give it up. The other third, nature reserves. The other third, not really empty. There are Bedouin tribes there. They really don't like you building power plants, solar power panels. For them, you're taking their land, its sovereignty, etc. They sabotage it, they steal it. There's a bunch of problems. And so what we're trying to do is solar PV panels in the cities, on the rooftops and interchanges, and even in cemeteries. We're trying to do that, but there's a lot of problems, regulatory problems, technical constraints, etc. And so we have a
regulatory problems in Israel? Surely not.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a problem, just like with the satellites, just like with water and food, we have a problem that no one else has. How do you get to 30% solar from electricity? Keep in mind, Europe is not trying to get there. Europe is also trying to get to 30% renewables by 2030. But renewables in Europe is also wind and hydro. We don't have wind and hydro. We only have solar. So we're trying to get to 30% just solar by 2030 in a country that doesn't have land. So we're trying to develop patents and solutions that nobody else has really taken seriously. And that's what we're doing in Bar-Ilan. So for example, you don't have land because the solar panels take up land and you need that land. So one solution is dual use solar panels. So you have you need to build the solar panels that are really, really thin, that also absorb the power from the sun, but the rays can still go through it, and you can grow agriculture. You can still grow beneath the solar panels, so they don't take up agriculture land. So we're developing that. The other thing is we don't have land, but we have a lot of sea, and it's pretty calm in the Mediterranean. So you can build solar panels in the sea, but the main problem is the salt, corrosive. It ruins the solar panels really, really fast. So our president, the president of Bar-Ilan, is a chemist, and he has a patent for self-repairing solar cells that know how to repair themselves from corrosion. So these are the type of things that we're working on. Whether it comes to storage, it doesn't matter how much solar panels you put. You need to back them up. You need storage, you need batteries so that they can create electricity at night. Otherwise, for every 100 megawatts of solar panels, you need 100 megawatts of coal or gas to supplement it during the night when there's no power from solar panels. You need to build batteries. It takes a lot of batteries. Those batteries are very, very expensive, and they use rare earth minerals like cobalt that's mined by kids in the Congo. So we're looking at patents to make these batteries from other materials. The most common material in the world, sodium, right? Salt from the ocean. We're working at creating batteries that use sodium instead of cobalt. And that's much cheaper. Another thing is power grids. If you want to have a grid that knows how to get electricity from 10,000 places all at once, right? From all of these mini solar panels that bring electricity into the grid all at once, you need a smart grid, digital grid. And if you have a digital grid, then that's open to cyber attacks. So you need cyber defense technologies, and Israel leads in cyber defense technologies. So basically the idea where I'm getting at is by 2030, we're not going to reach 30% renewables. But even if we don't reach that, it's not a big deal because we're not a player in CO2 emissions. Israel emits, out of the CO2 emissions in the world, man-made CO2 emissions, Israel is less than 0.2%. We emit 79 million tons a year versus 36 billion tons a year from the rest of the world. It's less than 6 months worth of SUV sales in the US. It's not, we're not making a dent in CO2 emissions. We're not a player. We're just 10 million people. So we shouldn't count our success by how much CO2 emissions are we emitting by 2030. Our success should be how many Israeli-made patents and technological solutions for solar have we managed to create and sell to the real polluters, to China, to India, to the US, to the Europe, to the Gulf, and they implement it over there. That's success, because climate change, CO2 emissions is a global problem, and it needs a global solution. It doesn't matter if I reduced CO2 emissions, if everyone else didn't. You know, Europe keeps saying, we reduced CO2 emissions. We're growing economically, but we reduced CO2 emissions. So the world needs to do that as well. The only reason Europe is saying that is because they just exported all of their emissions somewhere else. All of the heavy industry, textile, paper, metal, concrete, they just moved it to China and India and Bangladesh, and they're buying it from there. So they haven't, CO2 emissions have gone up every year, but Europe is saying that we reduced it. No, you just exported it to somewhere else, and you're buying and so China is emitting the CO2, but you're buying the products, and you're saying, you can't play with that. You can't, that's cheating. Israel is actually thinking globally, and we have a lot of potential to really make a dent when it comes to that. If we stop just looking at ourselves and start looking at kind of how can we affect others? How can we sell? And it, of course, it's not altruistic. The more technology we sell, the better foreign policy we make, the better foreign relations. And of course, it's great for our economy. It's a job maker. So that's where Israel can really shine, not in implementing solar panels in Israel, because it's a tiny market, but in selling the technology elsewhere.
Amazing. That's really fascinating, and I think that's something we should all keep our eye on for the future, and look forward to seeing how things develop there. Okay, there's a lot of questions. I'll certainly try and put as many of them as I can to you. So there's a very simple question here from Meir, which relates to something you talked about at the very beginning, which is, does oil in everything that you were talking about, does that produce CO2?
Yes, of course. The production of the consumption and production of oil emits CO2. There's no way around it. Coal emits much more, but yeah, if we want to reduce CO2 emissions, we need to electrify our vehicles. You know, electrifying our vehicles is great. We need to separate between CO2 emissions and pollution. If we electrify our vehicles, people say, no, it won't emit, it won't reduce CO2 emissions because you still need to create the electricity, et cetera. Yes, but it takes the pollution out of the city. Keep in mind that what's killing you today, not in 20 years from now from climate change, but what's killing you today is the exhaust fumes and the pollution that you're breathing on nose level pollution. And if you move to electric vehicles, you clean up the city. So that's great. So yes, oil produces CO2 and pollution, and that's a problem. If we want a solution, we need to decarbonize. Okay.
There's a nice geopolitical question here from Jeff Daub. So one of the countries we didn't mention was Iraq, and he says, can you talk about the consequences of the loss of the 4 million barrels a day of Iraqi oil from the global markets if the Iraqi regime destabilizes completely or falls under the sway of Iran?
Even if I'll deconstruct it. So the last part, even if it falls under the sway of Iran, it's still going to produce and sell oil, right? That's not going to prevent it from doing it.
The profits will just go to Iran.
Profits from somewhere else. You know, you can say that we keep talking about the relationship between an oil producer and an oil consumer as if it's asymmetric relations where the oil producer has all the power. Keep in mind, the oil producer is dependent on good clients to keep the regime, that someone is going to buy their oil. And even in the worst of times, oil exporters want to sell oil. They never don't want to sell oil. You know, Russia still wants to sell oil. Saddam Hussein, you can say a lot of bad things about Saddam Hussein. Not wanting to sell oil was not one of his traits. If the US people say that the US invaded Iraq for the oil. If they wanted oil from Iraq, they just would have they would take the embargo off and just send Halliburton and the oil companies to Iraq, and Saddam Hussein would love to sell the oil. That's not the problem. Having said that, if there's a civil war, if there's complete destabilization, then at least temporarily, a lot of oil, that's the first thing that happens in a civil war, is that rebel groups try to sabotage the main source of revenue for the government, which is usually the oil field. That's what we see in Libya. That'll take oil off the market, that will increase the oil. But again, if that happens, it's everyone's problem. And what happens in Iraq from that scenario, I don't know, but the oil is the first thing to go back online. That's what everyone wants. So that's usually what goes.
Okay, and staying with the sort of Arab states and geopolitics, question from Shmuel. He says, we see a increased cooperation of Saudi Arabia and other formerly or traditionally pro-Western oil states in the Middle East with Russia and China. How will this impact the status of the US in the Middle East?
China, at the end of the day, there's a bond between the US and Saudi Arabia, which is Saudi Arabia makes sure that oil flows, that the prices remain between a certain bandwidth. And in return, the US provides security guarantees, provides military assistance when needed. If someone blocks the Straits of Hormuz, then the US sends its Navy to help them. That's the kind of contract. If Saddam Hussein invades the US, right? China is currently just buying resources. It's not in a position where it can provide any security guarantees that are reliable to the Middle East. And Russia, whether it had that image that it can, completely destroyed its image with the whole debacle with Ukraine. Nobody would trust Russia to protect you with one of these big things. So currently the US is still the master of the seas. And so long as the US Navy is the master of the seas, the Gulf states are going to need the US to help it keep Now, this is great for US allies, that the US is the master of the seas and it keeps the oil transit free and it keeps the oil choke points, Bab el-Mandeb, Straits of Hormuz, Straits of Malacca free. That's great for US allies. That's not great for China. If, most of China's oil goes through the Straits of Malacca. It goes from the Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz in the Straits of Malacca and gets to China. Now, when something happens in the Straits of Malacca, the Navy that comes to help is the US Navy.
Right.
And that's terrible news for China, because if one day China finds itself in a global war with the US, the first thing that the US is going to do is block the Straits of Malacca, and there is no war. The war ended that moment because the Chinese military just becomes incapacitated. So China knows that, and China is currently trying to build a solution they're trying to build a blue navy, deep sea navy, battle destroyer, airplane carriers that can try to rival US Navy superiority, so they can not to become a global power, but at least to preserve, to kind of at least say that they can secure their own waterways. They don't need the US Navy to secure the Straits of Malacca. They can do it themselves, so as not to come to a point where the US suddenly blocks them. Deep sea navies are very, very expensive. Very few countries have them, and very few countries know how to operate them. It's a whole different ballgame to operate those kind of things. And China is trying to learn. It doesn't have any experience battling in the deep sea. It's trying to learn from Russia how to do it. But that's the only country that's willing to cooperate and has the know-how. Right now, all China cares about is securing the pathways, is making sure that no one can block its oil from the Gulf. And so it's trying to build the Navy, but more than that, it's trying to build ports. It's trying to control all the ports around the way. And it's trying to get the oil, not just by sea, but also by land, right? The whole Belt and Road Initiative is so that it will get supplies from multiple places to ensure that no one can cut it off. And so China currently, its involvement in the Gulf is mainly economical. It hasn't shown that it has the capacity to replace the US as a great military power that helps guarantees their security. It might happen in the future. Right now, everybody's pleased, even China is happy that the US is the one that does the dirty work. And China gets cheap oil from Russia and from Iran. So far, China isn't willing and doesn't have the interest to replace the US. It's a free rider in that sense.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question here from Rivka about, I guess, about the gas, Israel's gas, looking for a customer for its gas. She says, what about selling to Africa?
Well, selling to Africa, it depends on where, right? So Africa is a big place. Now, Egypt. Right.
You said we're already selling to Egypt, for example, which is obviously,
Egypt. Yeah, Egypt is a big client, and it could potentially be a bigger client. And it's a good question because we keep thinking about how can we export our gas, right? We want to be a gas exporting region. But what I think is more kind of feasible is that we start thinking about ourselves as a gas consuming region. And start using gas in much more efficient ways, not just for electricity generation, but for other things as well, because we have the gas. And that's not just us, we're just 10 million people. Egypt has 100 million people. It has a lot of potential to consume more gas if it electrifies through gas, if it uses more gas for public transportation, etc. It has a huge potential. Regarding the rest of Africa, the problem is the distances. Building a pipeline through Egypt to East Africa, A, it's not a big consumer of gas, and B, it's huge distances. So the more feasible is to liquefy the natural gas and sell it through liquefied. But if you're already doing that, then the Europeans and the Asians are going to pay more. So Africa is still not kind of considered, sub-Saharan Africa, whether East or West, is not really considered yet a big client for gas. And what people hope for is that they'll kind of do a leapfrog. They'll leap directly to renewables rather than start building coal plants and gas plants. Well, we'll see if that happens.
That's interesting. Okay. Question here from Jacqueline, who says, isn't there a scheme to work with Jordan to build a huge solar plant there for electricity for Israel in exchange for Israel building desalination plants?
Yes. So Israel doesn't have the land for solar panels, but Jordan has the land, right? It has a lot of land, and the solar radiation is higher in the south of Jordan. So that means that you can put the same panel in South Jordan and get more electricity via panel than in Israel because the solar radiation is higher there. So ideally, in an ideal world, Jordan will produce the electricity and we will buy the electricity from them and give them water, for example, desalinated water in return. So there is a plan to do that. It started from 1,200 megawatts. That was the original plan. Keep in mind, Israel consumes around 14,000 megawatts in a hot day in July, right? So this is supposed to be 1,200 megawatts. It's a big chunk, but then it went down to 600 megawatts, and 600 megawatts isn't big. The idea is that most of that will go to power the desalination plant, which will sell them water. The Jordanian people really don't like this. The Jordanian people have an ideological problem with the Jordanian king, selling and buying products from us. But they'll have to suck it up.
Yeah, indeed.
They need the money and they need the water. So that's just, there is a scheme, but it's just 600 megawatts. Israel consumes 14,000 megawatts, and Israel's growth rate is huge. It's not a Western level growth rate. We grow 3% every year. That's a lot for a Western country. Every year we consume 3% more electricity, and that's not counting electric vehicles. If we actually get more electric vehicles, the plan is to get 1 million electric vehicles by 2030. So we need much more electricity. And we need to decide, do we build gas-powered power plants or do we build solar power plants? And whatever we decide is going to stick with us for the next 40 years. And right now, gas is winning the battle. It's more efficient, it's cheaper because it's local. So that's where we are.
Okay. There's a question here from, the name on the Zoom is Carl and Anita. So I don't know if this is from Carl or Anita or both of them, but whoever it is, whichever of you it is, it's a good question. So what about Israel retaining the gas and developing plastic manufacturing to a greater degree and exporting the finished goods rather than the raw material?
So that's a thing that we're doing in a small scale. So, right, there are petrochemicals industries in Haifa, where I'm from. And they create ammonia, right? They create fertilizers with the gas. They create not plastics, but different oil distillates, etc. They sell it to Turkey. We have that, but it's a very, very polluting industry. And there's already a battle in Haifa to get those petrochemicals out of Haifa. They were built by the British, and I breathe it every day. So no one will.
Sorry.
It's very politically problematic to approve that kind of thing. But the general idea is that. The general idea is, let's find other ways to use our gas if we're not selling it to someone else, and we need to prove to energy companies that we have someone to sell the gas to, so they will look for more gas, then that makes sense. Maybe Egypt can do it. Maybe we need to start thinking about ourselves as a gas consuming region, not just exporting.
Right. So here's an interesting one, something we haven't touched on at all, actually. Linda asks, what happened to fracking in the US as an energy solution? Because I know fracking is quite a divisive issue in the US, but certainly those people who support it see it as one of the reasons why the US is no longer, or doesn't have to be dependent so dependent on Middle East oil. So is that, what about that as an energy solution? Also, just to add to her question, I only know about it in the US context. Are there other countries that are doing fracking as an energy source?
Yes, Russia is doing it, China is doing it.
Okay.
Anyone who has kind of good, in Europe, not so much, because there's a lot of bans of fracking, especially in West Europe. But if oil and gas prices continue to go up, they might rethink fracking. With fracking, there are three main problems. One is, fracking, the idea is you drill down into these formations, basically rock formations that are very porous. And in those pores, there's oil and gas trapped. So you need to find a way to drill down and then horizontally into that stone and then blast it with a combination of water and chemicals and sand. And then you blast it open, and then the oil and gas seeps out. The problem with that is that some of those chemicals seep into the water reservoirs, the underwater. That's one problem. The chemicals go in. Now, that was a problem in the US at the beginning because it was a very early technology. Americans very much still remember that. But to be fair, that almost doesn't happen anymore in the US because the technology has become safer in that sense. But the second major problem with fracking is earthquakes. It causes earthquakes if you frack in fault lines. So there are certain places where you can't frack. Otherwise, it's too dangerous. That is a major problem in the Netherlands, for example. The Netherlands started fracking massively around Groningen in the north of the country, and it started massive earthquakes over there where 40% of their buildings started getting cracked.
Wow.
And so all of a sudden, they just stopped producing gas, and they started a ban on, they reduced it by 70% in Netherlands in the past 5 years. This is one of the reasons why currently Europe, this is why Germany used to buy gas from the Netherlands. Suddenly the Netherlands stopped producing gas, so they imported more from Russia. So one of the reasons why Europe, despite the fact that they know Russia is a problematic country, have only increased their dependence on Russian gas is because they lost around 30 BCM that the Netherlands used to produce because of earthquakes. So they started buying more gas from Russia. So that's problem number two. Problem number three, and this is the most relevant one, it's very expensive. You need barrels of oil to be at least $60 per barrel to make a profit out of fracking. Now, that was the situation in the in 2008, 2009, during the Obama administration. Oil prices were very, very high, $120 per barrel. And so the Obama administration released a lot of licenses, even in Alaska, to go drill, to go frack, because we need to take the oil prices down. Well, it worked, and it worked too good. In 2014, the US became the major oil producer in the world because of fracking, and oil prices in 2014 crashed to the point where they got to $20. And a lot of these fracking companies went bankrupt.
Wow.
And all of the investment that the banks put into them, they lost those investments. So now for between 2014 and until 6 months ago, oil prices were really low. You remember last year in Texas, oil prices were negative, right? They were selling oil to someone just to buy it because there was nowhere to put it. And a lot of these fracking companies went out of business. Now, today, oil prices are going high again. They've reached way beyond $60. Now they're $90. And now it makes sense for fracking companies to go back and frack. But the banks are not willing to give them the loans because they're saying, wait, I give you the loans, you go back to frack, oil, suddenly the US is going to become the major oil producer once again. And then oil prices are going to crash again, and you're going to go bankrupt again, and all of my investment is going to go away. So the banks are not willing to fund it. And unless the Biden administration decides to subsidize these small fracking companies, it's hard. It's a very volatile business. That's where fracking went. From 2014, a lot of them went bankrupt, and a lot of them have a struggle to get the loans to go back online.
Okay, well, I think we're a little over time, so I think we're going to finish there. I'm sorry to those of you whose questions I didn't get to, but I want to thank Dr. Elai Rettig very much for an extremely informative evening, or at least evening here in Israel. You packed an incredible amount of information into this hour, so we're going to try and absorb as much of it as we can. But can you recommend for us websites or places that we can look for more information about this? Is it something Bar-Ilan or something that you're involved with where we can look at what's being done in these areas?
So first of all, if you want to know more about where renewable energy is heading, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's batteries, whether it's solar panels, then the Bar-Ilan University has NICE, right? That's acronym for National Institute for Sustainable Energy. We built 50 labs. We decided to go all in on those things. So Bar-Ilan, NICE, that's a great source for understanding kind of where the technology is going, because we're kind of trying to be at the head of that and the edge of the spear.
That's NICE, that's NICE, NISE.
Yeah,
right?
National Institute for Sustainable Energy.
Right.
If you want to know generally about energy markets, where they're going, there's the International Energy Administration, the IEA, they send reports. I really recommend reading a Daniel Yergin book. Daniel Yergin has wrote The Quest, The Prize, one of the best books. These are two books, but if you want to know about the oil industry, then read Daniel Yergin. And generally, don't buy, the media has a lot of misconceptions. They say energy when they mean electricity. They talk about transitions as if it's already there and we can just keep it in the ground. Don't rely on the media for energy information. They're not doing it to spite or because of a malicious intent. There's just a lot of misperceptions when it comes to energy. So try to get to the more kind of reliable sources. The IEA, the EIA, the US Energy Information Administration is a great source. They have reports. They have these really interesting kind of reports about choke points, about things like that for energy. Go to the good websites if you want to know more. There's the Oxford Energy Institute. And for renewables, that's where Bar-Ilan comes into play. And
Fantastic. Okay, well, as I said, it was a great amount of information. I'm already getting a lot of messages saying what an excellent program we've had this evening. And you're doing fantastic work, I know, at Bar-Ilan and the sustainable with the sustainable energy program there. So kol hakavod for that, and we look forward to seeing the fruits of all of that in the years to come, both for Israel and for the wider world. Just for everyone on the call, I've just written my email in paulg@begincentre.org.il for those of you who are not on my mailing list and would like to be and would like to get regular information about the English events that we do here, both at the centre itself and virtually on Zoom. Next week, we're actually not doing an event on Wednesday. We're doing one on Sunday, so just in 4 days' time. I have another one of these Zooms, so look out for the information there, either on my email or on our website or Facebook page. Thanks again to Dr. Elai Rettig. Thanks to everyone for joining us.